Thanks, Dorianne. Thanks, welcome. And as Dorianne said, I'm Rachelle, this is Annie, and we're the co-founders of RegionalCollab. Essentially, RegionalCollab is a platform that we founded for the kind of co-designed and co-funded project development that we believed is missing in rural, regional and remote Australia. So our focus is on RRR Australia. You hear us use the words RRR, rural, regional and remote. That comes from a passion of mine. I'm on the National Rural Women's Coalition, so every time I go to Canberra, I like to beat them over the head and remind them that people live further than the Great Divide. We're also really, really excited to have been invited to come and speak to you today. We're all about connecting with people, so part of what we'll talk about is the networks and how you use those networks when you're looking for funding as well. A few little sort of tidbit stories along the way that we can share with you. So without further ado, I'll let Rani start.
Oh no, we won't click over yet. So again, thank you. I guess just to kick us off, and thank you, Dorianne, for a great introduction, just to give you a bit of an understanding in terms of where we've come from in our own funding journey. So for us, a forefront of mind, as like everyone, is funding. So we made the great launch 8 weeks ago, and how we managed to do that is how this was all born was Rachelle was fortunate enough to be a facilitator for a federally funded regional employment trial, and that was where there was $1 million worth of funding available to regional areas, particularly the Northern Inland, to provide job opportunities for those in job network providers get access into employment. So through that process, we actually identified that there were so many other great projects and ideas out there that just didn't kick off because people didn't know where to start. They didn't know where to get the funding. They didn't know, the idea was too big. So that was the seed for RegionalCollab. So for ourselves, what we did is we actually went and found our own source of funding in the first instance. And for us, it was maximising in terms of our own skills and experiences. And we just took Kyle about how we kicked off is we actually got a contract piece of work through the university. And that was our seed funding to allow me to get out of my full-time employment into RegionalCollab as a full-time business. So again, why aren't projects activated? And you guys know better than anyone in terms of resourcing scarce. The idea is too big or too small. There are funding gaps. Sorry, we'll just get into this. It's too hard. People don't know where to get the money. So one of the big things about that network piece that Rachelle touched on is actually identifying that federally and state-based governments always have pockets of money. So through a connection of ours, we actually know that there's a federal minister who's got a $6 million pot of money at the moment that's not publicly advertised. It was drawn back in because the funding didn't get fully acquitted, and we know about that piece of funding. So that's through our networks. People don't know where to start, and that's where the SRI comes in. There's often funding gaps, so whilst grants, and we'll get into this a bit later, I'm not very good at this. So I'll hand over to Rachelle. We're going to get kicked off in terms of about grants and funding, and we'll just kick off.
So essentially there's 7 pillars of funding that you can consider when you're looking for funds. The first one is grants. Everyone knows about grants. Then there's donations. That's more in your not-for-profit space or charitable entities, obviously. There's also crowdfunding. Then there's the membership and alumni idea. Where you provide a service and someone's a member of your organisation and they get some benefit out of that. Running events is actually really, it's an interesting concept. People don't necessarily think about that as much, but you can actually get some funding for events, also promote your own business, and then do the networking and connection that we're talking about. There's also the sales and earned income component of the pillars, so essentially having something to sell. So for example, this project today we're excited because now we've started building something that we could probably turn into a saleable product down the track for our business as well. And then also community and business partnerships or sponsorships. At RegionalCollab at the moment, we're assisting businesses across a really varied range of industry sectors. So we're helping people in the healthcare community, higher education, as Annie said, with one of the contracts we have here. We've also jumped in both feet into the arts sector, which is really fascinating. We're helping people in technology and also government. So that government piece is because Annie and I have really strong backgrounds in local, state and federal government. I spent 20 years in Canberra, so when we talk about knowing where certain buckets of funding are that aren't advertised, that's because of the connections that we have from 20 odd years of working with those people and maintaining those networks at the moment. So I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about was organising and planning your approach to sourcing funds, because it might sound like a bit of a pain, but it's something you really have to do. There's a number of things that you have to do in deciding that you're going to make a request for any kind of funding. So the planned approach helps you sort of focus and understand what it is that you're looking for. So when you're looking for funding, whether it's grant funding or, you know, whether it's going for some kind of tender even for a contract, you need to make it meaningful, craft your story and start a conversation. You have to engage the people that you're asking the funding from. If you don't ask, the answer is always going to be no. That's one of the big things that Annie and I always push with people. You have to have a clear ask. So you have to know what it is that you're asking for. And so that's what the planning piece is about. It's about being really clear on what you're asking for, and then make sure that you know that back to front as your pitch when you're moving forward. Planning. You're going to get sick of hearing us say planning. It is the most important part of any of these processes. So you need to know what you need and how to get it, and ensure that you, when you're looking at those 7 pillars of funding that we were talking about, one of the most important things I think I want to stress today is that you diversify your revenue streams. It's really important because that will provide some resilience in your funding to your business, because you just don't know what sources of funding are available, how quickly they're going to come and be available or disappear. And you want to have ideally at least 3 of the 7 pillars to help maintain some form of resilience in your funding environment in your business. Do your homework and seek advice. Again, it's about not being scared to call people up and have a bit of a chat to them, and ask for assistance to help you if you don't know what you're doing. It's important also that the places that you choose to source funding from have some kind of common goal with what your ask is. There's a whole piece that I won't talk about now, but it's around that ethical funding, what you feel comfortable with regards to whom you're going to ask for money from. And you need to make sure that those values are aligned, or you're never going to be successful in the funding ask that you're going forward with. People and funders, I think this is something that I think we know deep down, but we don't think about all the time. People and funders don't give to causes, they give to people and to stories that they connect with. So the more that your story can resonate with the funder, the more successful you're going to be across the board. People like to know where their money's going, obviously, and so if they can identify with you with that story and with the eventual recipient of the money and where it's going and what you're doing with it, then they're happy. The other thing that's really, really important, and I don't think we can stress it enough, is about being grateful. So thanking the people who do fund you when you are lucky enough to win some funding. Essentially, that can be in any form. It can be through, thank you letters, thank you emails, putting a little bit of PR out if they're comfortable with you doing that, connecting with them in other ways on social media. The other thing is be persistent and be polite. So call the grant providers and talk to them. Tell them what you've got coming up and discuss if you're suited for a funding opportunity. So, for example, we're doing some funding for an arts business at the moment. So I've already found some funding. It's quite a large pot of money for this person, but we've done the initial connection, and now we're actually going to meet with the grant funders when they come up to our region so that we can talk to them and put front of mind what the business is that we're seeking the funding for. And when you do that, you're more successful. So you have to not be scared to pick up the phone and make that cold call. You have to be happy to swallow that frog and just go. So it's that building relationships, which I think is really the most important thing in any search for money. And it's also a really good life skill for your business moving forward in any case. So Annie's going to talk now about how to plan and create a funding strategy.
Okay, so we recommend when you're actually developing a funding strategy. So it means taking a staged approach and creating a plan so you have a clear understanding of what you're actually targeting in terms of your funding sources. So we recommend you create a plan that actually shows what sort of funding you want to get. So as we've shown before, there's so many different funding sources. So having a real clear understanding of what those sources look like and how they might best suit your business needs. How much funding do you actually want to get? When we've spoken to a couple of people in the last 8 weeks, you know, people aren't really sure how much they need. It's a matter of sitting down and looking at your project and working out what those different components are, what the cost pieces are, and where you might be able to multi-fund from different sources to meet the needs of your project. Who are you actually choosing to approach, and what funding aligns with your aim? So again, it's a matter of, you know, if you're in an R&D space, are you better off looking at a government environment, or is there those innovator activator hubs that are going to better suit your needs? And really, it's like target marketing for your product. It's targeting your grant and your funding sources that clearly align with your market and are going to give you your better bang in return. And what are you actually going to try and achieve through the funding? So 8 steps to a successful funding strategy. Now, don't quote us on this. We are not liable if you run through this and you don't get your funding, don't hold us to account for that. So we all recommend having a central funding coordinator. So that's someone who knows exactly where your funding opportunities are up to, where you've got your fingers in different pies, what you're trying to approach. So that means that you strategically aligned with what your funding sources are going to look like in the end. So identify your starting point. What questions do you need to ask? Why are you actually looking for the funds? So again, that comes back down to what part of your project are you trying to fund, and where does that align with the bigger picture? So identifying what types of funding suit your needs best. You know, what have you asked for previously? Did that work? Didn't it work? Did you get any feedback? And that's the other thing when you're doing these grant applications, is don't hesitate to ask for feedback if you're not being successful. I think that's often the way that we learn, and we encourage people to do that. How are you getting funding at the moment? You know, how many sources are you trying to get access to? And again, it's coming back to that strategically approaching in terms of where are your best funders going to be aligned with what your product and your service that you're trying to get off the ground or build. So third one is identify funding sources. So conduct market research, speak to similar businesses or mentors, and don't be afraid to ask questions. We recommend setting up a calendar, noting the best times to seek funding. So there's actually a lot of sources that you guys might be aware of, and we'll get onto this later, that actually tell you when funding rounds are closing. So you can actually set up a calendar of events to actually say that, you know, we know for argument's sake that there's a Qantas regional grants that closes on the 30th of August. So we're out at the moment and in our business promoting that, as well as we know in our calendar we've got until the 30th of August to get that in. We then know that there's other ones that are closing September, October, so that we're planning for when we're actually applying for those, and managing our projects around that.
I think there's 168 grants that we know of right now that close in August. So it's about knowing which ones are those that you want to focus on.
And which ones you want to focus on. You know, you could put in for 168, but is that realistic in terms of your investment and actually putting in the grant proposal? Or, you know, do you have 10 projects and can you then actually deliver on those? But we'll get to that later. So the 7 pillars of funding we referred to above. So making sure your systems are in order before accepting funding. So a lot of the funding that you get, particularly with government funding, has to be acquitted. So you actually have the systems in place to account for where you have actually spent the money, because trust me, they will come and ask for it back if you haven't acquit for it in line with your project. So that's also really important in terms of being clear with what you're actually asking for so that you can report back on against it. The other thing we just recommend, and I think the SRI do it on a similar level, is just start. Just once you've got your plan and your resources, just go. You've already really clear in terms of what your ask is. You know, and start small to get an understanding of the system. So the thing that Shell and I spoke about this morning was that grant writing comes quite naturally to Shell. So she's federally, you know, government trained. She's big background in procurement and all this other stuff. So it comes quite natural, but, you know, it's not a natural skill. And so taking the time to invest in it, for me, it's not a natural wordage thing. And it's really understanding what the grant funders or the funders are actually looking for out of your thing. So making sure that, again, it's that marketing pitch, I think you can align it to. So monitor, so use your plan and strategy to step back and check how you're tracking. Monitor your own exhaustion levels. So much energy goes into this stuff.
That's really important.
Don't get that return on it.
Yeah, you'll be devastated. You might set your heart on a piece of funding and you don't get it. So you really do have to step back and monitor that and just say, it's all right. It just wasn't meant for me. I wasn't their person. They weren't for me. And reset and keep going. Don't let that sort of knock you.
And the other thing I'll just touch on now is Shell and I have put in for a number of grants that we still haven't got outcomes on. So we
sometimes they're really slow.
There's a New South Wales Access to Justice one that we put in for our own idea, and we put that in March.
Yeah.
It was due to come out in July.
Still nothing.
And it's still going. We put in another one recently. So don't be afraid to go back and ask where things are up to, because often the chains of government are slow, as you probably most understand, and most organisations are like that as well.
So in that timing piece that Annie was talking about before too, obviously we've just had an election, so we have, even though the same government returned, the machinery of government changes will cause the cogs to start seizing, and some of that can be quite frustrating. So in the Indigenous space, for example, they're moving all of the funding from various places into one agency, and so that's taking an awful lot of time, and right now there's nothing there to access for Indigenous funding that's in the federal sphere. We're waiting for them to open that stuff back up, and it will be happening, but that's when we talk about timing and planning, you just think about that. And also new financial year, there's always new money. So new financial year, from now, August onwards, you'll start seeing more money coming out. I like to liken it to spring, and everything starts opening and it gets very exciting, and they're throwing the money around like Oprah. It is what it is. You get it. No. I wish. But yeah, so that's that. When we talk about planning and using a calendar, that's what you're doing. You're being strategic and thinking, okay, well, there's certain times of year there's probably not going to be a lot of funding around for me. You just have to accept that that's the case. But in that time, that's when you should be doing your planning. That's when you should be putting together what your projects look like and have all of that documentation ready to go, so that when you find the thing, you can hit the ground running.
And the other thing, no, you're right. And one of the big tips that we found as well is, and again, it's not necessarily in relation to grants, but certainly funding sources through private enterprise and stuff. They always have a special bent. So for argument's sake, a lot of the ones that we've done recently with Sun Super and Qantas, they've all got this real bent on regional Australia and community benefits. So you might have a project, for argument's sake, that has a small proponent that has got that bent on it. But what you do is, if you think that really does align and it might be a quick win for you, is you flip your messaging around your project. So you don't change your inherent project, but what you do is you change your messaging and that delivery around how you sell that. You're not, lying about what you're actually doing, but it's, again, flipping your messaging, so you're targeting exactly what the funding source is actually looking for in terms of outcomes. So we recommend doing that as well. The other thing is obviously celebrate what you've achieved and be grateful. Again, stay positive and then start over. I mean, I don't know how many grants we've put in for already, and sometimes we get no's and sometimes there's radio silence, but we have to keep going. It's not our primary source of income. Again, as a startup, we have multiple sources of income at this point in time, and that will flip and change as we progress in our business model. But for us, it's that seed piece that gives us the money to then go and do our passion pieces, and it's the stuff that kind of gets us exciting and flapping our arms.
Rightio. So back to the 7 pillars of funding that we were talking about.
Sorry, there's that, please.
Nice work. Here we go. We can leave that there and I'll keep talking about it. Yeah. So the 7 pillars of funding that we're talking about, grants being the first one, and pretty much the biggest one as far as the work that Annie and I do. We choose to seek grant money quite a lot. Grant makers always have a specific goal in mind, so you've got to just keep that in mind. When you're reading their guidelines, make sure that you're understanding what it is that they're asking for. Go do a bit of research, like literally stalk them on Facebook and on the socials, and find out what it is that they're looking for, so that you can connect with what their goal is, and then, like Annie said, your project can then better fit into what they're looking for. You need to be able to demonstrate to them how you can achieve outcomes for them, because everyone's about a nice ribbon cutting ceremony, don't get me wrong, but also how that's going to benefit the broader community, because generally speaking, that's what grants are looking for, is that community benefit piece. Donations is something that we don't necessarily go in. This is part of the 7 pillars. The reason that's there is because in not-for-profits, obviously, you can go down the donation track. The donors are usually obviously contributing to specific projects rather than the organisation as a whole. Crowdfunding, which is something that we're really passionate about and focused on at the moment. This is really useful for people who are looking for guidance around what's appropriate and effective in getting people to give. There's a lot of different crowdfunding platforms, and Annie's going to talk a bit later about crowdfunding. There is a little bit of risk associated with it, but at the same stretch, it's a really effective way of getting some seed funding. But you have to keep in mind that if you're going to ask for people to donate to a crowdfunding platform, then you better bloody well deliver. We also look at membership or alumni. So Annie and I have our first member of RegionalCollab, which has been amazing. It's a very supportive business who wanted to help us get going. So the membership is something that we did in return for services that we do. So we do sort of networking and putting together projects with this person who has become a member of RegionalCollab. And that's something that we plan to spin out further as we build the business. So membership programs are great. They're a handy source of predictable income. They're also a way to collect data. So people's email addresses, for example, asking for their permission to hold that information means that then you've got a ready source of supporters who you can go to when you've got new stuff happening, who you never know, again, in that networking space, what they might be able to do to assist you. And it gives you that nice supporter base, as I said. Events are something that's interesting as far as creating a stream of income. So there's actually a lot of money in grant funding and in lots of other types of funding for events. And you have to put the event on, but they can be profitable. So the only thing with events that I would sort of caution is that they are a large investment of time and energy to get them going. But, you know, forums and festivals, themed events, that sort of stuff is great for driving publicity for your business, raising awareness, improving and building reputation, and also, like I said, the source of making some money. You need to make sure that you can manage the timing and the focus and the scale and the shape of what that event is. So Annie and I do work in that event space with some people. Again, that's mainly through networks that we have of rural women in business and being able to put on forums where women can come together and listen to people who are in startup businesses or are sort of mid into their business life, so that we can connect and get that across rural, regional, remote Australia. Funding is available for events as long as it looks like you're going to get community benefit out of that, and you can take some of that money for yourself for creating the event. But like I say, you have to deliver, otherwise when you're doing your remittance, they're not going to be very happy. So the other thing is sales and earned income, as we talked about. Do you have any information that people can purchase from you? Is there a market for it? Something to always keep at the front of your mind. I think we were talking with Kyle earlier about doing some training, possibly teaching people how to use the drones. And so that's something to think about into the future. And that's kind of, I guess that would be one of the pillars. Annie and I definitely are building that as a pillar of our business at the moment. So it'll be around training and development work with RegionalCollab. So charge for what you know, what you do, what you have, or what you can sell is essentially what the message is there. The final pillar is around that community and business partnerships or sponsorships. So these are really good arrangements to get involved with. There's usually something required in return, which is fair enough. Usually they want some visibility, they want access to member benefits or stuff that you might supply to the market for whatever it is that your business is doing, or they might want some publicity. It's usually a very mutually beneficial relationship, and if you can maintain those partnerships over time, then you get that sort of trust and open communication and a shared vision, and you've got someone on your side for the rest of the time that you're in business with them. There are obviously elements of risk there, but there's also great reward with working in partnerships. A lot of businesses now are looking to do that community benefit piece, so partnering with businesses that can offer whatever that thing is that they're looking for. So for example, Regional Australia Bank here in Armidale does some amazing stuff in the community space, in the social enterprise space, because they want to connect back to community. So that's the sort of partnerships that we're sort of referring to there. Our NBN code's another one who's fantastic.
Which is the funniest story. So we met, she's the regional coordinator for NBN Co. At the New South Wales government had that Business Connect bus going around, and we happened to run into them. This is how weird. So we happened to run into them one morning when they were parked near the Newey, and we just got chatting to them going, what are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. This is what we do. Next thing, this lady who works for NBN Co, who's the regional coordinator, anyway, chatting to her, she's then invited us to use her space, the NBN co-space in the press club in Canberra. She's then sending us emails saying, come along to these forums. We kind of went, hang on, we've got some people who are interested in technology and using NBN for forums and workshops. How do you think about sponsorship? She's gone, we're definitely interested in that space. It's just like, right.
Don't be afraid to ask.
Don't be afraid to ask. So that was us going to get a coffee one morning and just happened to run.
You never know where those conversations will go. And never be afraid to
And she also put us in connection with some other people that can help us. So again, it comes back to that connection piece and asking the questions. And I'm shameless in that space in terms of saying, well, what can, you know, this is what we do. What do you do? And how can we help you? And what do you do?
Yeah.
So I guess you've all gotten the hint by now that grants are an important source of funds. There's billions of dollars in grants provided each year by local, state and federal government, as well as philanthropic, corporate and community trusts and foundations. To be successful, I think we touched on this earlier, you need to be really clear about what you're looking for and how it aligns with the application and the entity that you're actually applying for. You need to know who provides the grants that fit with your aims and needs. So Cheryl's going to run us through the process. This is her chisel.
Yeah, so basically this is your process here in a nutshell.
Sorry.
Did you have a question?
Just a little one.
Yep.
You mentioned, and I think that's a really important one, identifying the grant that suits. Identifying the grant that suits your need, or identifying your need and then the grant that suits. In the Ag Tech Gateway, there are a few founders that have applied for a grant, and I guess they switched the message as you suggested, but then ended up sort of going down a path that they didn't intend on because the grant required them to.
Yeah.
So would you say that that's a really critical, if not one of the most critical things, identifying what you're doing and the funding that matches that?
Completely. And Michelle's about, and we're going to touch on that in a second, in terms of you need to not only do that, but then expressly read and understand the conditions and the terms of the grant that you're actually applying for. Yeah. Because if you don't end up, as you said, Hamish, you're going to end up down a rabbit hole and a path that takes you away from core business and not what you essentially were looking for the funding for the project in the first place. And when I say flipping your messaging, I'm not saying flipping your whole project. Again, just to clarify, it's about changing the way you're explaining it to better align, but not changing your core. It's that flex in terms of what you're trying to do to match that grant. But those terms and conditions and that approach from the grant funder is so important, because as you said, otherwise you can end up in all sorts of places.
And not every grant's for you. Like, there are so many grants out there that you can get a bit of that FOMO, fear of missing out kind of stuff happening, and you're like, oh my God, there's so much out there, I don't know what to do, I haven't got the time. And so you just need, that's what the planning piece is about. Have a strategy plan, know what you're willing to go looking for, and then stick to that. Every now and then something will come from left field, and it might be an opportunity that you can't say no to, but yeah, generally speaking. And it's about contextualisation too. So in grants, when you look at what they're asking, that's, I think, when we're talking about that flipping the message piece, it's around the contextualisation of what the grant is asking. So it might be that you don't do exactly what the grant is asking you to do, but you've got transferable skills. And they may fund you because they may look at that project and go, hey, actually, we're really interested in that, and it's not exactly on what we're looking for. So that's some of the stuff that you can do as a kind of fly the flag up the flagpole and see how you go, if you've got the time. Not all of us have the time to do that, but we've done that every now and then and have been successful, because we've gone, well, we've got transferable skills doing this stuff. We might not have worked in that sector before, but we feel that we can bring something to the table for you, and we can deliver a project that would be beneficial in the following way. So you're still going to meet your KPIs that you're asking for in the community, blah, blah, blah. So that's what we mean is that contextualisation, looking at what it is and how you might be able to flip that. So talking about the actual process itself, like we said, identifying your need, making sure that you've got a project plan. So generally speaking, grants are looking for projects. So you need to be able to hone in on what the thing is that you want to go for a grant with. So one of the things that Annie and I do at RegionalCollab is we stand there and we whiteboard the shizzle out of stuff. We bring people in and we just let them spew their brains out on the whiteboard, and then we try to refine that down into something that looks like a project moving forward. It's really important to do that piece of work, that mind mapping or that dumping of your brain on a board, because as soon as you get that plan, then you can just you can describe the cause and effect, what you think your outcomes are going to be, and you can make sure that it's measurable, because at the end of the day, the most important thing for a grant funder is making sure that they can measure what you're doing and they get a return on their investment, obviously. So do your research and identify the grant program you think suits your needs, and that's looking at things like the situation. So what need are you addressing? Is this based on evidence, and how strong is the evidence? The government specifically now focuses on evidence-based funding. It's their favourite catchphrase. So the more statistical work that you can do and have to provide to them, the better you are. That being said, make sure that the statistics are around the environment that they're specialising in. Don't go left field and say, well, actually, here's a statistic that they might not believe in, because that's not going to be very useful. Other considerations that you can talk about is what assumptions are being made, and what are the risks. So it's a really good idea in grant funding to outline what the risks might be of a particular project, because they like to know that you've turned your mind to that. It's not sexy, but it is important. And then recognising what external influences may affect the grant moving forward or the project moving forward. So you're talking about environmental, economic impacts, and how that might affect the outcomes of your project. So, for example, we've been working on a project at the moment with the Costa Group, and it's been with regards to Yazidi refugees. And so it's been bubbling along quite well, but the last round of people who came through didn't have the English language skills that we required. So we've had to step back and say, okay, we're going to review why this is a problem. And so we've had to talk to the employment providers and work out why it is that their skills are not as high level as the last round of people were. And then we've gone and spoken to the government department and said to them, so this is what's going on. What we're going to do is stop here, do a review and flip the project. And that's the other thing I would say. It's really important to be able to know what's going on around in your grant, and don't be afraid to talk to your grant funder. They're not going to cut you off and take your money away. They prefer to have open communication with you, and they really do appreciate if you're identifying risks as they arise and starting to try to mitigate those. The other thing that you need to think about is the inputs. So, what's your human, organisational, business resources? So your time, your money, your research, your knowledge, your experience that you're putting into. Always put that into the budget. They like to see that. Sometimes it can be something that you can fund yourself out of a grant, but other times it's classified as in kind. So that's something that you're donating to the project. So you're saying, I'm giving you $30,000 of my skill and experience if you give me $120,000 to run this project. So there you go, I've got a $150,000 project, and they're excited because they're getting something for nothing in their mind. So it's important to always budget and factor that time and effort that you put in. Never be afraid to put that into the budget. And then the outputs are really important, explaining clearly what you're going to be doing with the grant funding, the activities that you're going to be running, what's going to be an outcome, and then also doing some review work at the other end is really important. So always schedule in, this is how we will review what we've done and show you, some kind of analysis on how successful or otherwise we were. So, for example, in the regional employment trials that I was running, that I'm still running, we had $1 million. We were seed funding a range of different projects to get people into employment, but not every single one of those projects was going to be successful. They gave us the $1 million and said, go hard and see what you can do, but if you have some failures, that's okay, because we want to see what works in your environment, because essentially that $1 million was seed funding for the government to then decide what they're going to do as far as building other programs for the Northern Inland region. So that's important to keep that in mind, and don't be afraid of failing. Like, don't set yourself up for failure, but if other things happen, we're in the middle of a drought and you decided that you wanted to do something that was related to water and all of a sudden it's not a thing, then you need to talk to them about it, and they will work out, oh, well, maybe we can twist that and it's not going to be about this thing. Maybe we look at, what the ramifications are of what you're going through. So outcomes, they like to see outcomes across short, term, medium term and long term. So your short term is obviously things like just a basic change in skills. So that the regional employment trial is about changing people's skills levels, giving them knowledge, getting them motivated to go back into work, giving them opportunity to get back into work. The medium term impact is about change in behaviour. So we're trying to change the behaviour of the job providers and their interaction with people who are looking to get into work. That's part of what the government has asked us to do in our project. As well as practices and policies and procedures. Then long-term impact is obviously around really significant change, so environmental change, social change, economic and political change. And this is where you're looking at long-term sustainable outcomes for community. Our tip, this is a little regional collab tip, is it takes just as much work to apply for a $10,000 grant as it does for a $250,000 grant or a $1 million grant. So make sure you factor that time in when you're going to apply for the grant, because it's the same amount of effort, trust us. They still have the rigour around the funding. You're still going to have to report. You're still going to put your time and energy into it. So the next phase is obviously applying for the grant and making sure that when you do, you read the guidelines, because up to 20% of submitted grant applications are ineligible, and that's a lot of wasted time. If you don't attain the grant. So, you know, you're not going to win every grant. We certainly don't win every grant. It just is what it is. But ask for feedback. We can't stress how important it is to ask for feedback, because sometimes we've asked for feedback and it's like, oh, we ran out of money. Literally, we ran out of money. It wasn't that we didn't like the cut of your jib. We just didn't have the funds left because we funded all these other people. And sometimes it's like, oh, the project wasn't quite what we were looking for. So then you can ask questions around that, so that next time if you see something similar, you can kind of understand what it is you should be doing. Then the last, obviously running the project, and at the end of it reporting back regularly. That's the one thing that you have to keep in mind, is that the review and report stage is really important. They want to see what your outcomes are. It is part of your contracted agreement. You are contracted or have some kind of agreement with grant funders, and they have an expectation to see some outcomes. So as far as where do we find them? So these are just a few places. There's a bazillion places you can go, but they're easy and they're hard to find, if that makes sense. So we've sort of said here, there's options like Google, government websites, council websites, philanthropic foundation websites that you might know of exactly. Newspaper and media advertisements often will talk about what funding is available. Then there's specialist grants search websites. So the Grants Hub is one that we use. It is actually a paid search engine, so you have to pay to be a member of that, and they push out an awful lot of grants. The Community Grants Hub is also really good. It's a government-based one, that particular one. There's also a government grants network that you can tap into. And then, yeah, that's essentially, well, we've got Farm Table up there too. I can't see because I haven't put my glasses on. So there's different sort of people who specialise in a particular industry sector who might send out, hey, guess what? Did you know there was this funding available? So the other stuff that Annie and I have is through our networks we've connected. So, for example, in the Indigenous funding environment, we're connected into Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in Tamworth and down in Canberra, and so we're on a bunch of email lists where they send us out the newest grant opportunities or newest programs or projects that are being rolled out, so that we're aware of what's happening in that space. So whatever your space is, focus on that and just drill down. Annie and I go down lots of rabbit holes looking for information. You've got to be really into researching to find the funding that you're looking for, and yeah, I think it's that curiosity piece. We're just always curious. Oh, where does that go? What's that doing? Who's that? Why are they connected? I wonder where that goes. And it's amazing what you'll find.
Rachelle, how do the government agencies themselves, be they state or federal, if someone has been allocated funds, how do they go looking for projects? Sorry. Or they don't. They just they put a sign up or they put something online and it comes to them. So none of them ever go out into the field or into business or into SRI organisations and look themselves. No,
that's correct. So government stuff will go through their own websites and that kind of thing. Will have their own grant stuff available. The secret pots of money that we talk about in government, that's about connection and network again. So the minister that I'm talking about, we're actually meeting with her in September. She had a $10 million program and she spent $4 million. She has $6 million sitting in a bucket, but she's not willing to put it out as a public offering because she doesn't really need people to know that they weren't successful in the first round of the project. So it's knowing how to get to that source of funding as well. So that's what we're meeting with them on, because they have this $6 million that they want to get rid of, literally. They don't wish to push it anywhere else, but they have some stuff that they would like to focus on. So,
but again, Hamish, that's about, we know about that because of our connections in that particular space.
Yeah.
So when we're talking jobs and employment, which is my background in HR, we've got connections into those spaces who have then got connections into federal government. So if you're in the ag tech space, I suspect you've got those advocacy lines and connections back into federal government that you will know who those people are that you need to be going, look,
ask the question.
Ask the question. Yeah, is there pockets of money lying around?
If you're a founder, they're not going to come to you.
Oh, goodness,
no. And this is what we're saying. Be curious.
Get yourself out there. Get those zip lines
Absolutely.
Get the contacts going. Be curious.
Look, I say in my advocacy work that I do, I go, ask the question. If they say no, ask them why. That makes them squirm in their seat. You're like, oh, that's great. Why? Is there anywhere else I can go and ask for some money? And eventually, when I find that in advocacy work, when we're asking, and we're usually asking for not-for-profit, obviously, so I go hard and say, well, oh, that's great, thanks, but can you tell me why you wouldn't give me that money? And then they kind of go, oh, well, actually, there might be someone who can, and they'll start thinking a different way. And it's just putting a little bit of pressure on them, but in a really polite, kind of fun manner, you know, respectful in what you're doing. But it's amazing if you ask the question, you know, and the worst they can say is no. You just don't take it personally. You're like, all right, thank you.
The other thing is, we met with a guy yesterday who came up from Sydney to meet with us. He's got this amazing project he's looking at rolling out nationally. We were talking to him about different funding options, and one of them was, so he's going to look at government funding and that sort of thing, but he's also sponsorship for certain parts of what his business model and that sort of thing. And one of the things that we talked to him about is going, well, okay, if we're going to apply, for argument's sake, to Telstra, for argument's sake, for this particular piece of funding through their grants program, for argument's sake, who do we know at Telstra that between us, or do we know someone that knows someone at Telstra that we can then start making those connections back in through the organisation, saying, as soon as they start hearing, you know, ABC business, they start going, oh, hang on a second, I've spoken to someone, they've got this great project they're putting in for funding. So again, it's about those networkings and making sure that your connections is selling your stuff along the way as well to get better success, so that when, you know, we do get to the table with a project and they're sitting around, someone could go, well, hang on a second, I've actually heard of that, or I've seen it on, you know, social medias, or I've seen it in the news, or seen it. And again, it's that kind of spider web of connections that we make indirectly or directly that do sometimes build into the success of some of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm just conscious of time.
Yeah.
We might just flip through. We did focus on crowdfunding. I'm not sure whether it's of particular interest. Crowdfunding is really good. It's immediate. It's short, sharp. It's specifically targeted on a project. It is really time limited, so you have to build that sense of urgency around the project. There are multiple crowdfunding platforms that you can use. You again need to go through and figure out what's the best one for you. So we were looking at something for a client the other day. And this one was particularly around creative arts, but when we looked into the terms and conditions of that particular platform, if you don't reach your target, you get none of the money. So you might get to $50,000 of your $60,000 target and you don't actually get that money. They also then charge a fee for collecting the money, so it's then 5%. So again, just if you are looking at crowdfunding for that quick and dirty money, and we look at it for some of our stuff as well in terms of, you know, let's use it. Some really positives around it in terms of, you know, you do, from your social media and your marketing point of view, it does get your message out. It starts, depending on, again, what area you're in, it does start getting your messaging out pretty quickly, and it gets into people who are actually interested in that space as well. So you start building your supporters and your brand profile in areas of people of particular interest. So if they're interested enough to donate some money to your cause, it's most likely they're going to start following you from a marketing PR point of view and going to be interested in your journey as you go through. So anyone can do crowdfunding. It's not restricted to your not-for-profits or entities or businesses that sort of thing. So, you know, individuals can do it. Just be mindful, as we know with the Easy for Lau thing as well, don't go onto GoFundMe if you're not doing for a medical or a personal reason. You've got to be, again, really specific in terms of what your funding platform
Yeah, there are different
is.
platforms for different types of fundraising that you'd be looking for.
So the response rate for crowdfunding is typically 25% higher than standard fundraising. It's low cost, as again, it said, it deepens your supporter engagement. Again, it's that marketing piece and aligning with what your actual project is, what are the people going to get out of it, making sure you're delivering and you're returning and you're actually saying thank you as you're going through, because you are going to build that, that supporters into future donors. I just don't want to go into that because the Activator Space is next, and I know that's of particular interest.
So the Activator Space is that sort of secret sauce that we were talking about earlier. Activator Space has been building over the last few years. Essentially, it's kind of a newly redesigned ecosystem, for want of a better description, supporting, financing and celebrating innovators and startup ventures with seed funding. And so this fits for people like us who are in the very early stages of building a business. There's multiple types of opportunities. So we've just listed a couple here. So there's the Angel Investment Network or Australian Investment Network, CEO, Innovation Activator and Equitize are some of the ones that we have had some dealings with. CEO is the one that fascinates me, just coming from the sort of National Rural Women's Coalition side of things. That model brings together 500 women who we call activators, and so each year they contribute $1,100. They choose to contribute $1,100. They call it as an act of radical generosity, which I absolutely love. That money is pooled together and then it's loaned out at 0% interest to 5 women who have ventures that are selected by their activators kind of as a panel, sort of like the SRI when you pitch, that sort of thing. So all ventures have to be revenue generating, have export potential and are creating a better world through their business model, their product or their service. So they're looking for that social benefit and the benefit to women and so forth. The loans are paid back over 5 years and then loaned out again. So it's that perpetual use of the funds. But what that does do is that they like to say that we're passing this on to daughters, nieces, granddaughters. You know, the 500 women activators at the moment are now a cohort or a de facto team. It's sort of like what Ag Edge does, which sitting across, I'm fascinated because I think it's a very similar model. And basically what they're doing is they're bringing buying power into as early customers into these women's businesses as well, and then using their expertise and advice and networks to continue growing those businesses. So that's essentially in a nutshell what the Activator Space is. CEO is one of them. It was started in Canada. It's in Australia now. It has I think it's also in the United States, and it's just started up in the United Kingdom as well. So it's going worldwide, and it's actually a really fascinating area of seed funding. And there's more and more people moving into that area. So whilst that's aimed at women, things like the Innovation Activator, for example, is a cluster of high-tech startups, so mechanical engineers, designers, factories and experts. They want their knowledge and experience to serve others, and so essentially they have a similar kind of approach. So there's stuff in every kind of business sector that you can imagine. Again, it's about doing that research and having enough kind of curiosity, I suppose, to drill down and find out where that information is. So that's what the Activator Space is in a nutshell. It's an exciting space, and I think it's worth looking into for startup business. There's a little bit of risk involved. Some of the activators will expect to have equity within your business, but things like CEO, zero equity. They just ask that you pay it back within that 5 years. So yeah, it's just you've just got to be aware of what their requirements are in each of those different segments that you're looking at.
Just on that. So just on that, if I'm a founder and I'm interested in starting to research the Activator Space and find some potential solutions that might suit me,
yep.
Where do I start? Do I Google activators? Like where do you start with some of these things?
Yeah, so starting literally Googling activator, you'll find, or seed funding activator will give you a good bunch of results. And also just in your own so depending on the industry sector that you're in, you'll find that people who are already putting out, emails and collecting information might mention new businesses that are starting to do this kind of work. But generally Google is a thing. So SheEO came across my desk because of the work I do with the National Rural Women's Coalition, because they came to us and wanted to talk to us about how they could connect into the women's networks and alliances that we work with. So it's that sort of stuff. It's literally just being curious and going out there and asking the question and talking to people like Annie and I as well, just saying, hey, I'm interested. Do you know if there's anything? I specialise in this sector. And not every sector has an activator at the moment, which also could be an opportunity for a business. Who knows? But yeah, they're sort of, they're kind of developing. It's a very new space and it's starting to broaden, and definitely broaden globally, which is exciting, because the idea of SheEO is that you can do the Australian SheEO, but their entire worldwide network gets on board. So you've got amazing exposure.
So great for founders who are trying to scale globally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's about it, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, that's all right. Sorry we went a bit over time.
No, that was excellent. So one of the things that I also will mention is that Rachelle mentioned Ag Edge. This is a group that my husband and I are part of, which is like a reciprocal board of advisors for family farm businesses. And Rachelle and Annie are actually, and I hope this is okay for me to mention,
You go.
they offer services to write grants applications on behalf of people who, this is obviously, from my point of view, it seems like a very time-consuming space, both in terms of application and then also on the end side in terms of reporting. And so we at Ag Edge have decided to outsource our grants applications to Rachelle and Annie. They find the grants that they think are suitable for us, write the applications, and then if the grant is awarded, they participate in a portion of the amount that's awarded. So that's probably another option for founders to be aware of, because I think we're all quite time poor, and clearly this is a highly skilled space.
Yeah.
Can I just ask then, so what would be your suggestion if there's 2 or 3, so if I'm a startup founder, I'd like to apply for a grant, would you say I should be very clear on my strategy, identify the grant that might be applicable, and then come and see you for support on how to apply for the grant?
You could definitely say that. Definitely. I'm all about that great sales pitch roundup, but no, definitely.
To get a clear message for the founders that might be watching this.
The thing is if you've got a rough idea of a project, and what we did, and I hope you don't mind in terms of the Ag Edge experience, was, so Charlie came to us and said, look, we want to get some funding. This is what we want to do. This is an idea that we had. But what we actually did is we took that and went, well, okay, let's go and find some funding sources. And we explored some stuff, and we knew that the regional community benefit, and we knew that there was some stuff around that space. So we went and looked and went, righto, well, here's 6 potential opportunities that match what you've kind of said. But before we even get to that grant application page, what we actually did was we got him in and we went, well, righto, we need to flesh this out. So even if you've got a little bit of an idea, but you don't actually have the broader project, what we can also do is flesh that out and sit and go, well, okay, so you've got this, have you thought about doing this, and let's expand it, and let's look at, do you need more funding, and how you might be able to co-fund from different spaces. And where we ended up in that particular instance was a couple of funding opportunities through organisations, but we started to talk about sponsorship and how sponsorship model might suit some of the activities that we explored and kind of went down and we looked at. So there is that idea, if you've got your project and you just need us to help write grants, definitely. But we can also help sit around the table, because how we like to work is sit around, and what we promote is sitting around that table is where you get your ideas generations. And it's having different people from different backgrounds where you start extending and exploring what you might have traditionally thought was, this is what I want to do. But if we could amplify it or diversify it and, extend on it, just by having that diversity around the table is where that real advantage, I think, of what we do. And having those connections into such a diverse space as well.
And sometimes you might have a crazy idea. We love it. Come in with a crazy idea and it might be, look, that's not going to work, but there's a seed of something in there. Let's pull that out and then tease that out into the thing that becomes your project. So no idea is crazy as far as we're concerned. It can be as broad and as out there as you like, because you can always focus that down into something that's going to be sustainable and is going to bring benefit through the grants community. So
last one very quickly, in terms of your participation in the successful result, is it a flat 5%, or is it more bespoke depending on the amount of work that goes into it, et cetera, et cetera?
And it's an interesting model. So we're only 8 weeks in, as we kind of touched on, and certainly our model at the moment is depending on the kind of work that we're doing. So Shell and I talked about flipping that model again this morning. So at the moment, the approach we've taken with some of our clients is we've actually doing the work and we don't take any money until we get a successful grant. And the percentage it's a commission-based, I guess, model. Depends on the amount of the grant that we're actually applying for, the level of work that we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, we're running a business. We need to start looking at how we might be able to flip that. And again, depending on, you know, what the client looks like, but essentially, yes, it's a percentage based on.
So up to a particular amount will be, say, 10% of that would come to us as a fee.
And we build that into the project. So we build that into the grant. So when you put your grant application in, there's a component around project management.
So you say, I want $50,000, we will add ours on because we don't expect you to try to run a project with minus the 10%. That comes to us through project management fees, generally speaking, because you can't ask for admin fees. So there's ways that we know how to manage that as well within the grant environment that is appropriate and is risk managed and is not going to cause any problems. But we've had a couple of projects we're talking about which are in the multi-million-dollar. So they're a different fee structure, as you can imagine. And if they came off, they would be amazing. And we're working with partners in that though. So we're talking multi-partner funding arrangements there. So there's co-funding and co-partnering to bring something to the table. It's generally federal government who are looking at those particular grants.
And we'll probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. Are there any questions? Anyone else for Rachelle?
Or on the video?
Oh, at the back, behind.
How big would be too big? So, or long-term goals. So if you have a long-term project that could potentially save the government $10 billion a year, is that too big? And how would you sort of frame that to the people? So you could structure it as that's the long-term goal, then you do the medium and the short. Would that be too big a goal for a long-term goal?
Yeah, it's usually too large. That sort of stuff is a different kind of arrangement. It's not necessarily in the grants field. It would be in partnerships with government. So it's able to be done, but you would be working in a different space. So you would be talking to ministers and it would almost be a quasi expression of interest tender kind of environment. So my background is I wrote the Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines a million years ago and the rules. And so that's also where my writing skills come in. It's understanding what the government's looking for and what they're going to be willing to give money to. So generally speaking, that kind of larger number is definitely going to be about partnering with government. The stuff that we do.
But in saying in saying that, what you could do if you have a $10 billion saving for government, that's your end game in however long that is. What you could potentially do is sit down and go, well, what are the milestones and the steps along the way? Break it down. And how do you actually then break that down into more sustainable chunks that are then more palatable for people to get involved in? So if you want to do the 10 billion saving and whatever that looks like in terms of that's the project down the path, and keep that as your message, but what are the milestones and how can you actually chunk that down into smaller pieces that you can then get to that process without it being such a what would typically be a substantial piece. Does that make, I mean, you've obviously thought about that.
Generally speaking, in the grants environment, they're looking at a 12-month turnaround. You might be lucky to get a 2-year turnaround. So the regional employment trial, for example, that I running with the $1 million is a 2-year, it was a 2-year component. So you could go in and say, I've got a project that's going to run across 2 years. That's actually quite unusual. Generally speaking, grants want to see you flip it around in 12 months because they need to be able to report back to government within 12 months. There's a whole reporting regime that's required. There are some grants that go obviously into higher education and they can be much longer term. They can go across numbers of years. but they're very specific about certain industry sectors or certain things that they're wanting to do research in, research and development, for example. So yeah, it's just, it depends on what you're looking at.
So starting with that big sort of goal, would it, things that you guys help out with, would it be worthwhile to sort of start with that and then break it down into those smaller tasks and say like, okay, well, this could be the point of entry. This is the lowest barrier of entry into that. Let's apply for this, start it. And if we get a good result, then we can sort of
pilot that. So essentially it's piloting the seed of that idea, and you're proving your concept essentially through grant funding. And if it's to government, for example, if they see something they like, then you can extrapolate that into the next phase and the next phase. So we have people we work with who specialise in that, like Carmen. And there's people doing that kind of work across, say, your employment sector, for example, because it's always a massive headache for government. They don't know what to do with it. They're always pulling their hair out. So you go in and you pilot. You pilot that thing and you say, so we think that this can work. Let's pilot it. Give us some money. They fund you to do the thing. You get a result in 12 months. It's almost like your lean startup stuff. So you go in and you might fast fail. You might have to pivot. You might have to recreate what that project looks like. But if the government gets excited about one single little piece of that, then they're willing to continue that funding. And then that becomes something more than just grant funding. So you might have started the pilot with a grant and then you might end up connecting during the partnership piece that we were talking about.
So it is a good entry point.
Good start,
okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay.
Would you, I think we'll have to maybe wrap up here, but
that's all right.
if anyone has any more questions for Rachelle